In Riverside Park, Marcus Davis was enjoying a serene afternoon. Sitting on a weathered bench, he immersed himself in a book, letting the warm sun and the sounds of children playing create a tranquil atmosphere. This park was a personal refuge for Marcus, a place where he could escape the pressures of his job and the world around him. Meanwhile, Officer Brian Harkins patrolled the park, his sharp gaze scanning for anything out of the ordinary. Having worked in this neighborhood for over 2 decades, Harkins believed he knew the area inside and out. However, when he spotted Marcus sitting alone, a sense of unease crept into his gut. He felt that something was off about a black man sitting quietly in the park. Despite not having any real evidence, Harkins's instinct told him to be suspicious. As Marcus continued to read, he felt the weight of Harkins's gaze upon him. When he looked up, he recognized the officer's expression, a mix of suspicion and prejudice masked as concern. This wasn't the first time Marcus had encountered such bias, and he could easily read Harkins's unease. Rather than show fear, Marcus remained composed, marking his page and meeting the officer's gaze head-on. Harkins approached, his posture stiffening with each step. He greeted Marcus with a polite yet tense "afternoon," while secretly searching for something to justify his suspicions. Marcus responded calmly, stating he was just enjoying the park. Harkins, still fixated on his preconceived notions, pressed for Marcus's identification, citing a vague description of a suspect they were supposedly looking for. Marcus's heart sank. He knew his rights and understood that he wasn't obligated to show ID just for sitting in a public space. However, he also recognized that refusing could escalate the situation. Maintaining his composure, he asked if he was under arrest, to which Harkins retorted that he would be if he didn't cooperate. Despite feeling frustrated, Marcus decided to comply, reaching for his wallet slowly so as not to provoke the officer further. When he handed over his ID, Harkins snatched it and, without hesitation, ordered Marcus to stand up. He kept his hands visible to avoid giving Harkins any reason to claim he felt threatened. As he rose, Harkins pulled out handcuffs and ordered Marcus to turn around. Although Marcus felt a surge of frustration at the unjust treatment, he chose not to resist. He turned and allowed Harkins to cuff him, despite the uncomfortable stares from onlookers. He remained calm, knowing that anger wouldn't help in this situation. As Harkins led him to the patrol car, Marcus felt weary, knowing that no matter his accomplishments, he was still viewed through a lens of racial prejudice. Once inside the patrol car, Marcus looked out the window as the trees blurred by. He was not worried about himself. He was an FBI agent, and he knew that Harkins would discover the truth soon enough. However, he felt exhausted from the weight of societal expectations and assumptions placed on him because of his race. During the drive to the precinct, Harkins couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He glanced at Marcus in the rearview mirror, asking what he was really doing in the park. Marcus replied calmly that he was just reading. Harkins scoffed, questioning how someone like him could spend an afternoon reading. Marcus raised an eyebrow, repeating Harkins's phrase, "A guy like me," in a measured tone. Harkins hesitated, realizing his bias but unwilling to confront it. Instead, he pressed on, frustrated by Marcus's calm demeanor and the implications of his own words. As they arrived at the precinct, the tension in the car was palpable. Harkins parked near the entrance and stepped out, still grappling with the reality of the situation. He had arrested a man who was not only innocent, but also a federal agent, underscoring the dangers of racial profiling and the assumptions made based on appearance. This incident highlights a broader issue: how ingrained prejudices can cloud judgment, leading to unjust situations that affect the lives of individuals like Marcus, who simply sought a moment of peace in a public space. After Marcus Davis was taken into the precinct, Officer Brian Harkins felt the mounting pressure of his mistake. He opened the back door of the patrol car, helping Marcus out, the cuffs still digging into his wrists. Brian's mind raced as they walked toward the booking area. This arrest had not gone according to plan. He was supposed to intimidate the suspect, not face a calm and composed individual who challenged him with every word. Inside the precinct, the usual buzz of activity filled the air, officers filing reports, phones ringing, and conversations humming. As Brian led Marcus through the main hall, he ignored the curious glances from fellow officers, not wanting to explain himself until he had a clear plan. They reached the booking area, where Officer Jenkins, a young man, looked surprised to see Brian bringing someone in. "What's this about?" Jenkins asked, his eyes darting between Brian and Marcus. "Caught this guy acting suspicious in the park," Brian replied, his tone clipped. He handed over Marcus's ID, unwilling to admit that he lacked a solid reason for the arrest. Jenkins glanced at the ID, then back at Marcus, a flicker of recognition passing across his face before he masked it. He began typing into the computer. "Captain Bennett's in her office," Jenkins said, handing the ID back to Brian. "You'll need to take him to her." Brian stiffened at the mention of Captain Laura Bennett, known for being tough but fair. He hadn't planned on involving her this early, but now he had no choice. "All right," he said, his voice tight, and guided Marcus to the captain's office. Marcus walked beside him, noting the tension radiating from Brian. Brian knocked on the door and entered after hearing Captain Bennett's invitation. Her office was organized, with a large desk and shelves lined with books. Captain Bennett, a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes, looked up from her paperwork. "Officer Harkins," she said, her tone neutral. "What's this about?" she asked as Brian stepped forward, guiding Marcus into the room. "I caught this guy in the park. He was acting suspicious, wouldn't cooperate when I asked for ID," Brian explained. Captain Bennett's gaze shifted to Marcus, and for a split second, there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes, though she quickly masked it. "Is that so?" she asked, her voice even. Marcus met her eyes, aware that she recognized him, but she was waiting to see how Brian would handle the situation. "That's right," Brian continued, his confidence waning. "I brought him in for questioning." Captain Bennett narrowed her eyes slightly. "And did you have probable cause to arrest him?" Brian hesitated, feeling the ground beneath him shift. "He wouldn't cooperate," he repeated, though his tone was weaker this time. "Officer Harkins, why don't you step outside for a moment? I'd like to speak with Mr. Davis alone." Brian blinked at the request, taken aback. "But Captain—" "Outside, Harkins," Bennett said firmly, leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, Brian released Marcus and stepped out, closing the door behind him. Once alone, Captain Bennett's demeanor shifted slightly. "Mr. Davis," she said, her voice calm, "I apologize for this misunderstanding." Marcus allowed himself a small smile. "No need to apologize, Captain. You're just doing your job." Bennett glanced at the closed door. "I'm aware of who you are, but I'd appreciate it if we kept that under wraps for now. I need to handle this situation carefully." "Of course, I'm not here to cause trouble, Captain. I just want to make sure things are handled properly," Marcus replied. "They will be," Bennett assured him. "I'll speak with Officer Harkins and deal with this appropriately. But I have to ask, why didn't you just tell him who you are?" Marcus's smile faded. "Because it shouldn't matter, Captain. My identity shouldn't be the reason he decides to treat me with respect." Captain Bennett nodded in understanding. "You're right. It shouldn't matter, but unfortunately, it does to some people." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of the situation hanging in the air. Finally, Captain Bennett stood. "I'll call Officer Harkins back in. We'll resolve this." Marcus nodded, knowing he had the upper hand now. The truth would come out soon enough, and Officer Harkins would have to face the consequences of his actions. As Captain Bennett opened the door, Brian stepped back inside, his expression wary. He could sense that something had shifted but didn't know what. He glanced at Marcus, who stood calmly waiting. "Mr. Davis here is not the man you were looking for. You'll release him immediately," Captain Bennett ordered. Brian blinked, the words taking a moment to sink in. "What?" "But Captain—" "Immediately," she repeated, her voice leaving no room for argument. Brian hesitated, finally reaching for the keys to unlock Marcus's handcuffs, his hand shaking slightly as he did so. The realization of his mistake began to dawn on him. As the cuffs clicked open, Marcus rubbed his wrists, giving Brian a measured look. "Thank you, officer," Marcus said, his tone calm but carrying an undertone of finality. "You're free to go," Brian muttered, stepping back. Marcus nodded and turned to Captain Bennett. "I'll be in touch, Captain. There's still a lot to discuss." Captain Bennett nodded in return, understanding the weight behind his words. "I look forward to it, Mr. Davis." With that, Marcus walked out of the office, leaving Brian standing there with a sinking feeling in his gut. The confrontation was over, but the consequences were just beginning. Later that day, Brian sat at his desk, the tension in his body refusing to dissipate. He had barely been able to concentrate since Captain Bennett had released Marcus. The unease gnawed at him, deepened by the fact that he still didn't fully grasp the implications of his actions. The silence of the precinct around him was both comforting and unnerving, a space for his thoughts to spiral. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps approached his desk, snapping him out of his reverie. He looked up to see Captain Bennett walking toward him, her expression serious. "Officer Harkins, my office, now," Captain Bennett said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Brian stood up immediately, trying to suppress the nervousness creeping into his demeanor as he followed her to the office. Each step felt heavier than the last. Inside, Captain Bennett closed the door behind him and gestured for him to sit. Brian hesitated before sitting down, feeling the tension in the room. Captain Bennett leaned forward, her gaze fixed on him. "Officer Harkins," she began, her tone measured but stern, "do you have any idea who Marcus Davis is?" Brian shook his head, his confusion deepening. "No, Captain. Just some guy in the park." Captain Bennett leaned forward, her gaze intense. "Marcus Davis isn't just some guy in the park. He's a special agent, one of their top agents, in fact." The words hit Brian like a physical blow. His eyes widened in shock as the implications of what he had done crashed down on him. "An FBI agent?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's right," Bennett said firmly. "And he's highly respected within the Bureau. His arrest is going to have serious consequences, not just for you, but for this entire precinct." Brian's mind raced, trying to piece together what this meant. He had profiled and arrested an innocent man based on his own biases. The enormity of his mistake began to settle in, bringing with it a cold, creeping dread. "I didn't know, Captain," Brian said, his voice shaky. "I didn't know who he was." "That's the problem, Harkins," Bennett replied, her tone still firm. "It shouldn't have mattered who he was. Your actions were based on assumptions and prejudices, not on any real evidence. You can't arrest someone just because they don't look like they belong in a park." Brian wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down, he knew Captain Bennett was right. He had let his biases guide his actions, and now he was facing the consequences. "What happens now?" Brian asked, his voice low, almost resigned. Captain Bennett sighed, leaning back in her chair. "For now, you're being placed on temporary leave while we investigate this incident. I've already spoken with the higher-ups, and they're not happy, to say the least. There will be an official review, and depending on the outcome, you could face disciplinary action, up to and including termination." Brian's heart sank. The thought of losing his career after over 2 decades in law enforcement was almost too much to bear. But as much as he wanted to deny it, he knew he had no one to blame but himself. "I understand, Captain," Brian finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Bennett studied him for a moment, her expression softening slightly. "I know this isn't easy to hear, Harkins, but you need to understand that your actions have consequences, not just for you, but for the people you serve. We can't afford to have officers who let their biases dictate their decisions." Brian nodded, though his mind was still reeling. The reality of his situation was starting to sink in, and with it came a flood of regret. He had always prided himself on being a good cop. Someone who upheld Harkin's actions had revealed deep-seated issues within the department, and she knew it was a challenge she couldn't ignore. The clock ticked loudly in the silence of her office, each second amplifying the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. She reached for a report, skimming through Brian's statement again, her brow furrowing at the familiar patterns of bias that had led to the arrest of Marcus Davis. Bennett had seen too many cases where assumptions clouded judgment, and she was determined to make sure this incident led to real change within the precinct. Her thoughts drifted back to Marcus, a respected federal agent whose career and dignity had been threatened by a misjudgment that stemmed from prejudice. She felt a sense of gratitude towards him for how he handled the situation. He didn't come in seeking revenge, but instead aimed to foster understanding and reform. That was the kind of leadership the police force needed. Bennett stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the bustling streets below. The world outside felt so different from the one within the precinct walls, where fear, assumptions, and biases could so easily intertwine and create devastating consequences. She knew that true policing was about community trust and respect, principles that had been overlooked far too often. Suddenly her phone rang, breaking her train of thought. It was the chief, and she braced herself for the conversation. "Laura, we need to talk about the Harkin case." The chief's voice came through, steady but with an undercurrent of urgency. "Yes, Chief. I'm aware of the gravity of the situation," she replied, her voice firm. "This is about more than just one officer's mistake. It's about the integrity of the entire department." "Agreed. I'm going to need you to prepare a comprehensive report. We have to be transparent with the community about what happened and what steps we'll take to prevent it from occurring again." "Absolutely," Bennett responded, feeling a surge of determination. "I'll also propose training sessions focused on bias recognition and de-escalation techniques for all officers. We need to ensure everyone understands that their perceptions can be skewed." "Good. We also need to consider a public statement, something that acknowledges the mistake and shows our commitment to change." "Of course," she said, her mind racing with the potential impact of their words. "It's essential that the community knows we're taking this seriously." After the call ended, Bennett sat back down at her desk, knowing that the path ahead would be difficult. There would be scrutiny, there would be backlash, but she was willing to stand firm in her resolve. She reached for her pen, ready to draft a plan for the training sessions and the statement. As she wrote, her thoughts returned to Marcus. She knew that he could be a valuable ally in this effort for reform. Perhaps he would be willing to participate in the training, to share his experience and insights with the officers who needed to hear it most. Bennett made a note to reach out to Marcus later, her mind shifting to the possibilities of collaboration. Together, they could initiate a shift within the department, one that could ripple out into the community. The clock continued to tick, but Bennett felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about addressing one incident, it was about creating a better future for the precinct and its relationship with the community it served. And for the first time in a while, she felt a spark of hope that change was not only possible, but necessary. The moral of the story emphasizes the importance of accountability, reflection, and the willingness to confront one's biases. Change is possible when individuals take responsibility for their actions, seek understanding, and commit to ensuring justice for all, ultimately highlighting that the pursuit of justice must include a deep commitment to self-awareness and growth.